My little brother died 7 years ago. I took this dead-end job in the middle of nowhere to save up and finally leave the town where it happened. But last night, I heard him calling my name from the kitchen of the diner where I work. He sounded so scared. And the thing is, the customers here and the ones who only come out after the sun has bled out of the sky, I think they're the ones who have him. I think they want me to trade places with him. I think that's what this job really is. The Starlight Diner isn't on the way to anywhere important. It's a relic, a forgotten island of flickering neon marooned in the vast, silent ocean of the Arizona desert. By day, the heat makes the asphalt shimmer and the whole world look like a blurry, faded photograph. But by night, the darkness is absolute, a physical presence that presses against the wide glass windows. The only sounds are the hum of the ancient refrigerator, the hiss of the coffee pot, and the lonely howl of the wind as it scrapes across the sand and rock. I am the sole keeper of this little bubble of light from 10 p.m. until the sun crests the distant mesas. It's a job that pays just enough to be worth the profound isolation, a place where I can be alone with my thoughts, which is both a blessing and a curse. Most of the time, the silence is my companion. It lets me think, lets me plan my escape. A small apartment in a city where no one knows my name, a life where the memories don't have so many familiar streets and corners to hide in. But sometimes, the silence gets too loud. It amplifies the ghosts of the past, specifically the ghost of my brother, Michael. His laughter in the static between radio stations, his face in the reflection of the darkened windows. I took this job to run away from that, but out here with nothing but the hum and the wind, there's nowhere to run. The loneliness is a heavy blanket, and some nights it feels like it's trying to smother me. It was on one of those nights, when the weight of the past felt particularly crushing, that everything changed. The harbinger of this change was Sal, the diner's owner. He's a man who looks like he's been wrung out to dry by the desert sun one too many times. His skin is leather, his eyes are a permanent squint, and his hands are perpetually stained with grease and something that looks a lot like rust. He usually just grunts a goodbye and disappears into the night in his beaten-up pickup truck. But on this particular evening, just before the clock on the wall was about to strike midnight, he paused at the door. He turned around, his face illuminated by the red glow of the open sign, and the expression on it wasn't its usual tired indifference. It was something else, something that looked disturbingly like fear. He shuffled back towards the counter, pulling a folded, yellowed piece of paper from his back pocket. It was slick with grease, its creases worn soft like old cloth. He slid it across the counter to me, making sure his fingers didn't touch mine. "Leo," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "The rules for after midnight." He wouldn't meet my eyes, instead focusing on a spot on the wall just over my shoulder. "You just follow 'em. Don't ask questions, don't get creative. Just do what it says on the paper, you understand?" I picked it up, a small, confused smile on my face. I figured it was some kind of hazing ritual, a joke for the new guy on the graveyard shift. "Sure thing, Sal," I said, trying to sound casual. He just grunted again, a final, sharp sound, and then he was gone, his truck's engine roaring to life and quickly fading into the oppressive silence of the desert. I unfolded the paper. The text was typewritten, faded and smudged in places. It felt ancient. It read, "If a man enters and orders a black coffee, no matter what he says or does, never serve it with sugar. If the jukebox begins to play a song that is not in its repertoire, go into the kitchen, lock the door and count to 100 before coming out. Never comment on the weather to the woman who always wears a heavy winter coat, even in the heat of the desert. If the landline phone rings, let it ring 3 times. If it rings a 4th time, answer by saying only, 'We are not hiring,' and hang up immediately." I read the list twice, a chuckle escaping my lips. It was absurdly specific, like something out of a cheap horror novel. A prank. It had to be. Still, there was the memory of the genuine fear in Sal's eyes. Shrugging, I folded the paper and slipped it into my apron pocket. It was just a list, a stupid list. The large, round clock above the counter ticked loudly in the empty diner. Each second felt deliberate, heavy. As the long red hand completed its sweep and landed on the 12, and the date flipped over to a new day, a subtle shift occurred. It wasn't anything I could prove, But the quality of the silence changed. It was no longer empty, it was expectant. The hum of the refrigerator seemed to drop an octave, becoming a low growl. The shadows in the corners of the room deepened, seeming to stretch and twist like living things. I felt a chill crawl up my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. I stood behind the counter, polishing an already clean glass, feeling the crinkle of the paper in my pocket, telling myself over and over that it was all in my head. That's when the bell above the door chimed. The sound was dull, muted, as if it had to travel through water to reach me. A man stood there, silhouetted against the pitch-black night. He was tall, unnaturally so, and he moved with a strange gliding stillness that made no sound. He wore a simple, slightly dated suit. He closed the door gently behind him and drifted towards the counter, his eyes fixed on me. They were dark, and they seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. He took a seat on one of the worn vinyl stools, his long fingers resting on the countertop. He didn't look at the menu. He didn't look at anything but my face. After a moment of unnerving silence, he spoke. His voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. Black coffee. My heart hammered against my ribs. Rule number 1. I turned to prepare the drink, my hands trembling slightly. It's a coincidence, I told myself. Lots of people drink black coffee. As I placed the steaming mug in front of him, he began to speak, and his voice was completely different. It was filled with a deep, resonant sorrow that felt utterly genuine. He told me a story about his daughter, who had passed away recently, how she loved sweets and how the bitterness of the world was all he could taste now. He looked at me, a tear tracing a path down his cheek. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Just one spoonful of sugar, just a little sweetness to cut through the dark." I froze. Every instinct in my body, every shred of human empathy, screamed at me to give this poor, grieving man what he wanted. It was just sugar. A simple kindness. But then I saw Sal's face in my mind, the stark terror in his eyes. I saw the faded type on the greasy paper. My throat felt tight. I'm sorry, sir," I stammered, my own voice sounding foreign to my ears. "The sugar dispenser is empty. I can't refill it until the morning shipment." It was a clumsy, transparent lie. The man's face changed in an instant. The grief evaporated. The tear on his cheek seemed to retract into his skin. His expression became a perfect, unnerving blank slate. He picked up the scalding mug, drained the entire contents in a single silent gulp, and placed it back on the counter with a soft click. He laid down a few coins, the exact price, no tip, and without another word he stood up and glided out of the diner, disappearing back into the all-consuming darkness from which he came. For nearly an hour I was alone again, but the silence was now a screaming void. I replayed the encounter in my mind, trying to find a rational explanation. He was an actor, maybe. A weirdo testing the new guy. A drifter with a flair for the dramatic. Any explanation would do. Anything to chase away the cold dread that had taken root in my stomach. I was wiping down the counter for the 10th time when a new sound cut through the silence. It was music. The old jukebox in the corner, a machine I was sure hadn't worked in years, had sputtered to life. Its colorful lights cast dancing, distorted shadows across the diner floor. But the sound coming from it wasn't Elvis or Johnny Cash. It was a lullaby. A soft, simple tune played on a tinny-sounding piano, but it was horribly out of tune, the notes sour and discordant, grating on my nerves. My blood ran cold. I slowly walked over to the jukebox, my feet feeling like lead. The song wasn't listed on any of the selection cards. It was an impossible song. Rule number 2. If the jukebox begins to play a song that is not in its repertoire, go into the kitchen, lock the door, and count to 100 before coming out. My mind rebelled. This was insane. I was a grown man, and I was supposed to hide in the kitchen because of a faulty jukebox? But the memory of the coffee man's empty eyes, the absolute certainty of his wrongness, overrode my logic. Fear, cold and sharp, was a tangible thing now. I felt like a child who is afraid of the dark, only my monster was real. With my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, I backed away from the jukebox and hurried towards the kitchen. The swinging door felt impossibly heavy. I pushed through it, my hands fumbling with the lock on the other side. The click of the bolt sliding into place was the loudest sound I had ever heard. Leaning against the cold metal door, in the sterile, fluorescent-lit kitchen, I began to count. 1, 2, 3. My voice was a shaky whisper. Outside, the distorted lullaby continued its painful melody. And then, over the music, I heard another sound. A soft, rhythmic scraping from the diner. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It sounded like someone dragging a metal fork across the floor tiles. Then came a whisper, a low, sibilant hiss that slithered through the crack under the door. It sounded like a dozen voices speaking at once, and they were all trying to say my name. I counted faster. My eyes squeezed shut, sweat beading on my forehead. The scraping stopped. The whispering faded. By the time I reached 98, 99, 100, the only sound was the frantic thumping of my own heart. The lullaby had stopped. A deep, profound silence had fallen over the diner once more. For a long moment I just stood there, pressed against the door, too terrified to move. Finally, gathering every ounce of courage I possessed, I slowly unlocked the door and pushed it open. I peered into the main dining area. It was empty. The jukebox was dark and silent. Everything was exactly as it should be. A wave of relief washed over me, so powerful it made me dizzy. It was a glitch, a prank. My mind had played tricks on me. I let out a shaky breath and stepped out from behind the counter, ready to laugh at my own foolishness. And then I saw it. There on the gleaming black countertop, in the exact spot where I had been standing just moments before, sat a single, perfect, brilliantly white sugar cube. It wasn't a prank. The rules are real, and whatever is out there in the dark, it follows them too. I don't know what these things are, but they are testing me, and tonight I think I failed. They know I saw the sugar cube. They know I understand that this isn't a game. If you want to see what happens when the sun goes down tomorrow, subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. Because I have a horrible feeling that I'm not going to be alone in here tonight, and frankly, I don't want to have to face this by myself. The sugar cube sat on the counter like a judge's gavel, a stark white declaration of guilt against my sanity. I didn't touch it. I couldn't. I just stood there watching it, as the long, terrifying hours until dawn dripped by. Each tick of the clock a hammer blow against the fragile shell of my composure. The diner had transformed around me. It was no longer a simple, lonely workplace. It had become a stage, and I was the unwilling actor in a play whose script I couldn't read. The familiar hum of the refrigerator now sounded like a predator's growl. The shadows in the booths seemed to hold their breath, and the wide desert outside the windows felt less like an empty space and more like a vast, patient audience waiting for the next act to begin. When the first fragile rays of sunlight finally pierced the oppressive darkness, it didn't feel like a rescue. It felt like an intermission. Sleep offered no escape, only a series of fractured, feverish nightmares. I saw the tall man's featureless face, heard the discordant lullaby played on a piano with human teeth for keys, and felt the crushing weight of an ancient, cosmic indifference. I arrived for my shift the next evening, haggard and on edge, the sugar cube still in my pocket, its sharp corners a constant nagging reminder. Sal was there, wiping down the grill with a grim slowness. I walked straight up to him, my heart a frantic drum in my chest, and placed the sugar cube on the counter between us. "What is this, Sal?" I demanded, my voice raw and louder than I intended. "What the hell is going on in this place after midnight?" Sal's reaction was not what I expected. There was no confusion, no denial, no attempt to laugh it off as a joke. He flinched, his eyes darting to the sugar cube as if it were a venomous spider. A muscle in his jaw twitched, and for a fleeting second, I saw the same raw, primal fear I'd seen in his eyes the night before. But it was immediately suppressed, buried under a flash of pure, unadulterated anger. "You saw nothing," he snarled, his voice a low and dangerous rasp. He swiped the sugar cube off the counter, his knuckles white, and crushed it into a fine powder in his fist. "You come in, you serve the coffee, you clean the grill, and you keep your damn mouth shut. That's the job. People are not the only things that get hungry out here in the desert." he continued, his gaze locked on mine, his eyes like chips of obsidian. You are paid to serve. You are not paid to see. You are not paid to understand. You do your job, Leo, and you forget everything else. Or you walk away right now and never look back. He brushed the white dust from his hands, a gesture of finality. He was drawing a line, not just in the sand, but around the entire diner, with me on one side and the horrifying truth on the other. He wasn't a co-conspirator. He was a prisoner, just like me, only he had long ago accepted the terms of his incarceration. His warning was clear. Curiosity was a luxury I could not afford in this place. But I couldn't walk away. Quitting felt like surrender, like admitting that the things in the dark had won. It felt like abandoning my post, and a new terrifying thought had begun to fester in my mind. What if these rules, this strange nightly ritual, weren't just for my protection? What if they were protecting the world from whatever was out here? Leaving felt irresponsible, a betrayal of some unspoken duty I had stumbled into. No, I couldn't run. If Sal wouldn't give me answers, I would have to tear them from the diner's greasy, silent walls myself. The establishment was no longer just my employer. It was my adversary, a living puzzle box with a monstrous secret at its core. My investigation began in the storeroom, a cramped, dusty space that smelled of stale cardboard and chemical cleaners. It was a monument to decades of neglect. Boxes of fossilized paper napkins were stacked to the ceiling, alongside rusted cans of peaches and pyramids of styrofoam cups. I searched for hours, sifting through invoices from the 1970s and faded employee handbooks that preached the importance of service with a smile. It was a hopeless, frustrating task. I was about to give up, to resign myself to Sal's decree of willful ignorance, when my hand brushed against a loose floorboard behind a stack of old tires. A cold thrill, a mixture of dread and excitement, shot through me. Prying it open with a tire iron, I found a small, hidden compartment. Inside was a dented metal footlocker, sealed not by a lock, but by a thick layer of dust that suggested it hadn't been opened in a very, very long time. With a groan of protesting metal, I forced the lid open. The air that escaped was stale and musty, the smell of forgotten years and decaying secrets. The locker was filled with old, leather-bound logbooks, the kind accountants used to use. There were at least a dozen of them, their pages yellowed and brittle. I grabbed the one on top, its cover embossed with the faded gold letters. Starlight Diner, nightly log. I sat down on an overturned bucket, the single bare bulb overhead casting long dancing shadows, and opened it. The handwriting inside was a neat, looping cursive belonging to a man named Arthur. The first few entries were painfully mundane. Grill cleaned, mop water changed, 2 truckers, 1 coffee, 1 pie. But as I flipped through the pages, the entries grew shorter, more erratic. Then I found it, an entry from about a year into Arthur's tenure. Man in the suit came in, asked for black coffee, kept talking about his late wife, almost gave him the sugar, a close call. My blood turned to ice. I flipped forward. Jukebox played that damned song again. Stayed in the kitchen for a 200 count this time just to be safe. Heard scratching at the door. I frantically grabbed another logbook, this one from a decade later. The handwriting a frantic scrawl from a woman named Maria. Her entries were even more chilling. She came in tonight, the woman in the coat. I almost asked her if she was too warm. She just stared at me and smiled. God, that smile. I was not the first, I was not special. I was just the latest in a long, unbroken line of unwilling participants. My predecessor's log was at the very bottom. His name was Kevin. His entries were only a few months old. They began with the same cynical disbelief I had felt. He called the rules Sal's little power trip. But that tone quickly changed. His neat print devolved into a desperate, barely legible scrawl that pressed so hard it tore through the paper. "They know my name," one entry screamed in capital letters. Another, circled multiple times, read, "The phone rang 4 times. The voice on the other end. It sounded like my mother." His final entry, dated just 2 days before I was hired, was a single shaky sentence. "It's not about the rules anymore. It's a test, and I think I'm failing." The rest of the page was blank. I had to work my shift that night. armed with the horrifying weight of this new knowledge. The diner no longer felt merely expectant, it felt actively predatory. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind against the glass sounded like a prelude to an attack. I was a sentry at a haunted outpost, and the logbooks were the final testaments of the soldiers who had fallen before me. I spent the first hour after midnight in a state of heightened paranoia, jumping at every shadow, my hand repeatedly straying to the cold, heavy tire iron I had brought out from the storeroom and hidden beneath the counter. Just after 1 in the morning, the bell above the door chimed its dissonant, watery tone. She stood in the doorway, and I knew instantly it was the woman from rule number 3. A thick, heavy-looking wool coat was buttoned up to her chin, a stark and ludicrous sight in the sweltering desert night. She moved to the counter with an unnerving grace, her feet making no sound on the linoleum. Her face was pale and smooth, her age impossible to guess, and her eyes held a placid emptiness that was far more terrifying than the coffeeman's blank stare. She ordered a cup of chamomile tea, her voice a soft, pleasant melody that was entirely at odds with her unsettling presence. As I served her, my hands shaking so badly I almost spilled the hot water, I repeated the rule to myself like a mantra. Never comment on the weather. Never comment on the weather. She took a slow, delicate sip of her tea, her gaze fixed on something over my shoulder. Then she began to hum. It was a quiet, almost absent-minded sound at first, but my entire body went rigid. I knew that tune. It was a simple, slightly off-key lullaby that my mother used to sing to me and Michael when we were children to chase away nightmares. A melody I hadn't heard or even thought of in over 15 years. It was a memory so deeply buried, so intimately personal, that hearing it from the lips of this thing felt like a profound violation, as if she had reached a spectral hand into my skull and was casually plucking the strings of my most private sorrows. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. My vision swam. This was the test Kevin had written about. This was the escalation. They weren't just presenting me with strange phenomena anymore, they were targeting me. They had accessed my past, my grief. I wanted to scream, to demand how she knew that song, but the rule held me in place, a psychic shackle. I clenched my fists under the counter, my knuckles turning white, focusing all my energy on appearing calm. I turned my back to her, pretending to wipe down the espresso machine, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The humming continued for a few more agonizing seconds, then stopped. When I dared to look back, she was gone. She had left the exact payment for the tea on the counter, neatly stacked. But next to the coins was something else, a small spiral seashell, its surface worn smooth by the ocean, with a distinctive pearlescent sheen on its inside. It was identical to the one Michael had found on our one and only family trip to the beach, the year before his accident, the one he had given to me for good luck, the one I had lost a decade ago. It was impossible. It was a message. My mind reeled, trying to process the implications. They weren't just observing me, they were studying me. They had access to my memories, my regrets, my deepest and most painful losses. They were mining the grief from my soul and using it to forge weapons against me. The question was no longer simply, what is happening here? It was a far more terrifying one. What exactly do you want from me? The seashell in my pocket felt heavier than a gravestone. It was no longer just an object, it was a symbol, a piece of irrefutable proof that the boundaries of my own mind were no longer secure. My memories, my grief, my most private moments of sorrow, they were now a shared resource, a library from which the patrons of this desolate outpost could check out items at their leisure. The diner itself seemed to be in on the conspiracy. In the oppressive silence between midnight and dawn, I felt its presence, a low tectonic hum of consciousness just beneath the surface of reality. It was watching me, testing me, and with the discovery of the seashell, it had made its intentions clear. This wasn't a haunting, it was a meticulous psychological dissection, and I was the specimen pinned to the board. My nights became a blur of caffeine-fueled hypervigilance and obsessive research. The storeroom was my sanctuary and my torture chamber. With the tire iron always at my side, I spent every spare moment poring over the forgotten logbooks, my fingers stained with the dust of dead men's fears. I was no longer simply looking for corroboration. I was searching for a weapon, an escape clause, a single crack in the monolithic facade of this nightmare. I started a new logbook of my own, not of nightly duties, but of the patterns I was uncovering. I cross-referenced every strange occurrence, every mention of the man in the suit, the woman in the coat, the impossible songs, creating a chilling cartography of the supernatural. I was an archaeologist, digging through the ruins of other people's sanity, hoping to find a map that would lead me away from my own. It was during one of these frantic sessions, with logbooks spread across the dusty floor like tarot cards, that the pattern finally emerged from the chaos. It wasn't in the nature of the encounters, but in their duration. I was looking at the end of a logbook from a man named Daniel, dated 1987. His last entry was a panicked scrawl about the jukebox lights flashing in the pattern of a constellation he only saw in his childhood nightmares. After that, nothing. A new logbook began the next day with a new name. I pulled out Maria's log from the 90s. It too ended abruptly after a terrifying entry about seeing her own reflection in the coffee man's eyes. Then Arthur's, Kevin's, and 2 others I had found. Their tenures were all different. Some lasted a year, others 3. But the dates of their final desperate entries held the key. With trembling hands, I wrote down the years of the disappearances: 1980, 1987, 1994, 2001, 2008, 2015. My heart seized in my chest. 7. A perfect 7-year cycle. It was a ritual, as predictable and relentless as the turning of the planets. The diner wasn't just a place where strange things happened, it was a clock, counting down to a recurring, horrifying event. I scrambled for Kevin's log, my breath catching in my throat. His final entry was from the last week of August 2015. I looked at the calendar hanging on the storeroom wall, its picture of a smiling cartoon cactus mocking my terror. It was the 3rd week of August 2022. The 7th anniversary was not some distant threat. It was days away. I wasn't just working a job, I was standing at the epicenter of a temporal detonation, and the fuse was already lit. Panic, cold and absolute, threatened to consume me. Sal's words echoed in my head. Walk away right now and never look back. It was the logical choice, the sane choice. I could get in my car, drive until the Starlight Diner was nothing but a forgotten speck in my rearview mirror, and disappear. But a darker thought took hold. What if leaving was part of the test? What if the cycle required a final participant? The logbooks were filled with those who had vanished. What about those who had escaped? My only hope was to find someone who had stood where I was standing, stared into the same abyss, and managed to step back from the edge. I began to frantically search the logs again, this time for an anomaly, for someone who hadn't disappeared, but had simply left. After what felt like an eternity, I found him. A man named Frank Rizzo. He had worked the night shift from 1995 to 1999. His entries detailed the same chilling encounters, the same creeping paranoia. But his logbook didn't end with a scream. It ended with 4 simple, defiant words written in clean, steady script. This is my last night. There was no explanation, no final horror. He had just quit. He had gotten out. Frank Rizzo became my obsession, my single desperate hope for survival. Finding him was a descent into a different kind of madness, a frantic race against the ticking clock of the 7-year cycle. I spent my days at the small town's library, hunched over microfiche of old phone books and running his name through public record databases on the wheezing, antiquated computers. The search led me 2 towns over, to a desolate patch of land where the desert began to claw back the edges of civilization. There, at the end of a long unpaved road, was a small dilapidated trailer, surrounded not by a fence but by what looked like a makeshift wall of scrap metal, old tires, and barbed wire. Blackout curtains were taped over every window, and a faded "No Trespassing" sign was riddled with what appeared to be shotgun pellets. This wasn't a home, it was a bunker. This was the fortress of a man who had spent the last 2 decades waiting for something to come find him. As I approached, a motion-activated floodlight snapped on, blinding me, and a voice, rough and trembling with paranoia, yelled from inside, "Get the hell off my property!" "Frank? Frank Rizzo?" I yelled back, holding my hands up in a gesture of peace. "My name is Leo. I work at the Starlight Diner. I need to talk to you." The name of the diner hung in the air like a curse. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, the sound of multiple bolts being drawn, and the trailer door creaked open a few inches, held by a thick chain. A pair of wild, terrified eyes peered out at me from the darkness within. The face was gaunt, the skin pale, the hair a wild mess of grey. He looked like a man who hadn't seen the sun in years. "You're a ghost," he rasped, his voice trembling. "They sent you. To prove I was real, that I was living the same nightmare, I pulled the pearlescent seashell from my pocket and held it up in the harsh glare of the floodlight." Frank's eyes widened, and a sound, half sob, half gasp, escaped his lips. The chain rattled, and the door swung open. "Get in," he hissed, "quickly, before it gets dark." The inside of the trailer was even more claustrophobic than the outside suggested. The air was thick and stale. Every reflective surface, mirrors, windows, even the screen of a small television was covered with black cloth. Strange hand-drawn symbols, similar to some I'd seen doodled in the margins of the logbooks, were taped to the walls. Frank, whose hands never stopped trembling, explained his theory in a torrent of hushed, frantic words. He confirmed the 7-year cycle. He called the diner an abattoir for the soul, a place that didn't kill you physically, but was designed to systematically strip mine your sanity, your memories, your very identity, until nothing was left. "The rules," he said, his eyes wide with a 2-decade-old fear. "They aren't for our protection, kid. They're a filter." He explained that the entities, the Watchers, were drawn to a specific kind of psychic energy, a blend of grief, curiosity, and a stubborn refusal to let go. The rules were designed to sift through employees, discarding those who were too rational or too quick to flee. Those who stayed, those who obeyed, even when it defied logic, those who felt the pull of the mystery. We were the ones they were interested in. "They test you," Frank whispered, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. "They want to see how much you can take. They want to see if you'll bend, and if you do, which way you'll break." I ran because I felt myself starting to enjoy it. The fear. The secrets. I knew if I stayed, I wouldn't just be a victim anymore. I'd become a part of the place. His warning was a chilling litany of do's and don'ts, the desperate survival guide of a man who had barely escaped with his mind intact. Don't engage them, don't ask questions, don't even think about them if you can help it. Be a ghost, be a machine, clock in, do the work, clock out. The moment you let them know you're trying to figure out their game, they've already won because that's what they feed on. Your attention is their nourishment. He grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong, his eyes boring into mine. "And the phone, kid. For the love of God, the phone. That's how they get inside your head. It's not a real phone, it's a direct line. If it rings a 4th time, you have to answer, I know. But brace yourself, it's their final exam." I returned to the diner that night, feeling as though I were walking to my own execution. Frank's words hadn't provided comfort. They had simply given a name and a shape to the monster that was hunting me. The knowledge was a crushing weight. I tried to follow his advice. I tried to be a machine. I focused on the mundane tasks, refilling the salt shakers, wiping down the counters, stacking the coffee cups into perfect pyramids. I refused to look into the dark corners of the room. I refused to listen to the whispers of the wind. I tried to turn my mind into a blank, silent space, but it was impossible. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the terrible certainty of the 7-year cycle and the approach of the anniversary. The diner watched me, and it knew that I knew. Then it happened. Just after 2 a.m., the stillness was shattered by a sound so archaic and out of place that it made me jump nearly out of my skin. The shrill, metallic ring of the landline phone mounted on the wall behind the counter. My entire body went cold. The sound was an assault, a violation of the unspoken truce of the night. Ring. I squeezed my eyes shut, reciting rule number 4 in my head. Let it ring 3 times. Ring. My hands were slick with sweat. I could feel the diner's attention, the collective gaze of the unseen watchers focusing on me on that phone. Ring, 3 rings. It stopped. My body sagged with relief. It was a false alarm, a test I had passed. But then, after a pause that stretched for an eternity, It shrieked again, a fourth, final, undeniable summons. My feet moved on their own, a puppet pulled by the strings of the rules. I walked to the phone, my heart a wild animal throwing itself against the cage of my ribs. I remembered Frank's final desperate warning. It's a direct line. My trembling hand lifted the heavy black plastic receiver. I pressed it to my ear, the plastic cold against my skin. I spoke the required words, my voice a choked whisper that was barely audible. "We are not hiring." For a beat, there was only the hiss of static, a sound like a distant, empty ocean. I began to hope, to pray, that it was over. Then a voice began to form out of the static, a composite of 1,000 whispers, a chilling chorus of dead leaves and dry insect wings. It was ancient and vast, and it spoke a secret that ripped my world apart. It said, with a terrifying, intimate clarity, "The brakes on his bike were cut, Leo, it wasn't an accident." And then, the line went dead, leaving me in a crushing, absolute silence, the weight of a 7-year-old lie suddenly and horribly brought into the light. The black plastic receiver slipped from my numb fingers, clattering against the linoleum floor with a sound that seemed to crack the very foundation of the world. It was the only sound in the universe. Everything else, the hum of the cooler, the buzz of the neon sign, the frantic beating of my own heart, had been swallowed by the deafening silence left in the wake of that single, monstrous sentence. It wasn't an accident. The words did not just echo in my mind. They detonated, sending shockwaves backward through time, rewriting every chapter of my life with a poison ink. The grief I had carried for 7 years, a familiar, heavy cloak, was ripped away, replaced by something infinitely more horrifying. A truth that turned my defining tragedy from a cruel twist of fate into a deliberate, calculated act of murder. For the rest of that night, I was not a person, but a ghost, haunting the space behind the counter. The diner, with its placid, malevolent patience, seemed to recede, granting me the space to drown in my newly poisoned reality. Every cherished memory of my brother Michael was now a potential crime scene. I saw his smiling 8-year-old face, scraped and bruised after the fall, and my gut churned with a retroactive, helpless rage. I remembered the small, somber funeral, the hushed whispers of sympathy from our neighbors, and now saw not a community in mourning, but a gallery of potential conspirators. The phone call had been a scalpel, expertly wielded to sever me from the anchor of my own history, leaving me utterly adrift in a sea of suspicion and horror. When the merciful light of dawn finally broke, I stumbled out of the diner, not into a familiar hometown, but into a hostile, alien landscape. The sun's warmth felt like a mockery. Every friendly wave from a passing car, every casual good morning from a neighbor watering their lawn, was filtered through a new, ugly lens of paranoia. I saw Mr. Henderson, the retired mechanic who had offered to take a look at Michael's mangled bike for my parents, and my blood ran cold. I saw the quiet, curtain-twitching woman who lived across the street, who had always seemed to know everything about everyone. My past was no longer a place of solace. It was a labyrinth filled with liars and murderers, and I was the only one who had been given the map. Driven by a sliver of desperate hope that I was losing my mind, that this was all an elaborate hallucination, I sought out Sal before my next shift. I found him in his small, cluttered office, hunched over a pile of invoices. I didn't ask about the phone call. I knew he wouldn't answer. Instead, I grabbed the edge of his desk, my voice a ragged plea. "Sal, you have to tell me, am I going crazy?" I needed him to lie to me, to call me a fool, to give me a rational explanation I could cling to. He slowly looked up, his gaze devoid of sympathy. He saw the new, fractured terror in my eyes, the psychic wound left by the phone call, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of something dark, like pity. But he simply took a long drag from his cigarette, blew a plume of smoke towards the ceiling, and pointed a nicotine-stained finger at the clock on the wall. "Shift starts in 5, he said, his voice flat. My personal apocalypse was irrelevant. The cosmic machinery of this place had a schedule to keep. His indifference was a final confirmation. My sanity was my own problem, and it was failing fast. That night, I was drawn back to the storeroom, to the metal footlocker that served as the tomb of my predecessors. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I felt a magnetic pull, a sense that the story, wasn't complete. I ran my fingers over the brittle pages of the logbooks, the final testaments of the damned, feeling a grim kinship with the authors. It was then that I felt it. A slight thickness in the worn leather spine of the oldest log, the one belonging to Arthur. Using my pocket knife, I carefully sliced open the stitching. Tucked deep inside, preserved like a forgotten relic, was a small, folded square of paper, so brittle it threatened to turn to dust in my fingers. I unfolded it to reveal a final, handwritten rule, the script a spidery, terrified scrawl. It was numbered 5. It read, "If the kitchen door opens on its own, do not look inside. Do not listen to what calls from it. It is an invitation. What it offers is a lie. Never accept the invitation." The arrival of the anniversary night was not marked by a storm or a dramatic change, but by its opposite, a profound and unnatural stillness. The relentless desert wind died completely. The hum of the refrigerator ceased. Even the ever-present buzz of the neon sign outside seemed to have been extinguished, though its lurid red light still bled through the windows. The silence was a physical pressure, a thick, suffocating blanket that muted all sound. The diner was holding its breath. The air grew cold and dense, smelling of ozone and ancient dust, and I had the distinct impression that I was no longer in a building on the side of a highway, but in a self-contained pocket of reality, a bubble where the normal laws of physics had been suspended for the evening's performance. The nightly patrons, the familiar avatars of my dread, did not appear. The man in the suit, the woman in the coat, they were conspicuously absent. But I was not alone. The diner began to fill, not with people but with presences. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them taking their seats in the worn vinyl booths. A sudden drop in temperature in the corner, a faint, fleeting scent of damp earth by the jukebox. The distinct prickling sensation of being watched not by one pair of eyes but by dozens. It was a silent, invisible congregation, a jury of ancient, unknowable things that had gathered from the dark spaces between the stars to witness the culmination of the 7-year cycle. They were here for the final act. They were here for me. The assault, when it began, was intimate and merciless. They used my newfound agony as their instrument. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the polished chrome of the milkshake machine, but it wasn't my face staring back. It was the smiling, greasy face of Mr. Henderson, the mechanic, his eyes glinting with a terrible secret knowledge. The speakers of the jukebox crackled, not with a discordant song, but with a distorted audio clip, the upbeat, heroic theme music from Thunder Riders, Michael's favorite childhood cartoon. It was a sound so innocent, so steeped in a time before the world had broken, that hearing it now, in this place, was an act of exquisite psychological torture. The very atoms of the diner were being weaponized against me, each object a vessel for a memory they had stolen and corrupted. A surge of pure, defiant rage, hot and cleansing, roared through me. This was my grief. This was my brother. It was the one thing left in the world that was mine, and they were using it as a parlor trick. "Who are you?" I screamed into the crushing silence, my voice cracking with the strain. Who did it? Tell me. My voice sounded small and pathetic in the vast, silent room. I grabbed the nearest coffee pot and hurled it against the far wall. It shattered with a satisfyingly loud crash, hot coffee splashing across a faded poster of the Grand Canyon. For a single, fleeting moment, the act of violence felt like a victory, a reclamation of my own will. I was not a specimen. I was not a rat in their maze. I was a brother, and I was demanding justice. The diner's response was swift, silent, and soul-crushing. It did not retaliate. It simply demonstrated the futility of my rebellion. On the floor, the shattered shards of ceramic and glass began to twitch. Slowly, impossibly, they slid across the linoleum, drawn together by an unseen force. Piece by piece, the coffee pot reassembled itself, the cracks knitting together until it was whole again. It levitated from the floor and settled gently back on its burner. Not a single drop of coffee spilled, not a single scratch on its surface. The message was delivered without a word. Your rage is an amusing but temporary anomaly. We are the authors of this reality. You are merely a character, and you will play the part we have written for you." My defiance crumbled into dust, replaced by the cold, heavy certainty of my own impotence. And then, at precisely 3:33 a.m., a time I noticed on the clock with a detached sense of dread, I heard it. A single, soft, mechanical click. It was the sound of a lock disengaging. I turned my head slowly, already knowing what I would see. The swinging metal door to the kitchen, the one I had physically bolted from my side just an hour before, was moving. With a silent, inexorable grace, it swung inward, opening not into the familiar, sterile world of stainless steel and fluorescent lights, but into a chasm of perfect, featureless black. It was a darkness that did not contain shadows, but was itself the substance of shadow. A void that seemed to actively consume the diner's light at its edges. My mind screamed the words from the brittle paper. Rule number 5. Do not look. Do not listen. I clamped my hands over my ears, squeezed my eyes shut, and turned my back on the impossible doorway. I focused on the feeling of the linoleum under my feet, on the rhythm of my own frantic breathing. I would not look. I would not listen. I would not accept. But the voice, when it came, did not need my ears to be heard. It bloomed inside my skull, as clear and as real as a memory brought to life. It was Michael's voice. Not the corrupted echo from the jukebox, but the real thing, the high-pitched, slightly lisping voice of the 8-year-old boy I had lost, and he was crying. "Leo," the voice pleaded from the center of my brain, "I'm lost. It's so dark in here. They told me you were coming to get me. Please, Leo, I'm scared." In that moment, everything else ceased to exist. Frank's warnings, the 7-year cycle, the coffee man, the rules, they were meaningless whispers in the face of that sound. The raw, desperate terror in my brother's voice was the only truth left in the universe. The entities had played their final card, and it was the one I could never defend against. They hadn't just told me he was murdered. They had brought him back to be my tormentor and my salvation. The sliver of a hope, so insane and yet so powerful, was that this was not a trick, but a transaction. They were offering me a chance, a path into the darkness to undo the greatest wrong of my life. The lie, if it was a lie, was one I was willing to believe. With a choked sob, I dropped my hands from my ears. The crying in my head continued, a heartbreaking, relentless sound. I turned to face the yawning abyss that had usurped my kitchen. The darkness beckoned, promising an impossible reunion, a final absolution. Tears I didn't know I had left to cry streamed down my face, tears of grief and guilt and a terrible, soul-destroying hope. I took a single, faltering step towards the threshold, my own voice a broken whisper that was swallowed by the profound silence. "Mikey, I'm coming." From the precipice of the void, the sound of the crying child ceased instantly. It was replaced by a voice that was still Michael's, but it was stripped of all fear, all innocence, all warmth. It was a voice that was cold, clear, and anciently, horribly adult. And it spoke with a chilling, triumphant satisfaction. "We knew you would." I took another step, my will no longer my own, drawn inexorably toward the lie, my feet carrying me over the edge and into the waiting, patient dark. And so, I stood at the edge of everything I had ever known, with my dead brother's voice, or a perfect, cruel facsimile of it, beckoning me into a darkness that promised an impossible reunion. This is the moment of truth, for me and for you. For 7 years, this place has chewed up and spit out employees, their stories ending in scrawled warnings and terrified silence. I am the one who made it to the anniversary. I am the one who received the final invitation. Before I tell you what I found on the other side of that door, I want you to leave a comment. Tell me what you think the terrible truth of the Starlight Diner really is. Is it a gateway to hell? A hunting ground for some ancient entity? Or something else entirely? Let me know your final theories, then hit that subscribe button, because the story isn't over until the last secret is revealed. And I promise you, the reality is so much worse than anything you could possibly imagine. With the phantom echo of Michael's voice as my guide, I took that final, fateful step. The moment the sole of my shoe crossed the threshold, the world dissolved. It was not a feeling of falling or of movement, but of instantaneous and absolute negation. The red light of the diner, the smell of stale coffee, the solid floor beneath my feet, it all ceased to be. The doorway did not lead into a dark room. The doorway itself was the destination. I was suspended in a place devoid of dimension, of temperature, of time. There was no up or down, no light or shadow, only a silent, seamless, and infinite non-existence. My body was gone. My senses were useless. Yet my consciousness remained a single terrified point of awareness floating in an ocean of pure nothing. This was not the darkness of a closed room. It was the darkness from which the universe itself was born. The terror of this sensory oblivion was short-lived, replaced by an experience for which the human language has no adequate words. It was not a vision, not a sound, not a voice, but a direct and overwhelming torrent of pure information poured directly into the core of my being. It was the feeling of a billion ancient books being opened and read simultaneously inside my soul. I felt the slow, patient grinding of tectonic plates, the silent scream of a star collapsing into a black hole, the intricate dance of atoms in a single grain of desert sand. I was experiencing the universe not as an observer, but as a component. And with this impossible perspective came the first layer of the horrifying truth. The Starlight Diner was not a place in the world. It was a pin, a single vital anchor point hammered into the fabric of reality to keep it from unraveling. This place, this consciousness, existed outside the neat, linear flow of what we call time. It was a lighthouse standing on the shore of an ocean of infinite, chaotic possibilities. Other realities, other physics, other ravenous and unthinkable things that press against the thin veil of our existence. The diner, with its mundane facade of vinyl booths and greasy spoons, was the focal point of its attention, the tangible interface through which it monitored the integrity of the barrier. It was a cosmic watchtower, and for reasons I could never comprehend, it required a human custodian. It required a janitor for the nexus of all creation, and the graveyard shift was a perpetual, unending job interview for that very position. The patrons, the so-called watchers, were not monsters in the way I had imagined. They were not here to feed or to torment for sport. They were something far more terrifying. They were auditors, projections perhaps, or aspects of the greater consciousness, each one a specialized tool designed to test a specific facet of the candidate. The man with the black coffee was a test of obedience against empathy. The woman in the coat was a test of discipline against curiosity. The jukebox was a test of resolve against fear. They were a living, interactive diagnostic designed to measure a human's capacity to withstand the psychological pressures of existing so close to the absolute, to see if they could hold the line without their sanity shattering into a million pieces. This was the purpose of the 7-year cycle. It was not a countdown to a sacrifice. It was a probationary period, a term of candidacy. The logbooks were not just warnings, they were the failed resumes of my predecessors. Those who broke the rules were deemed unreliable and were discarded, their consciousness dissolved, their existence erased from the timeline as neatly as wiping a spill from the counter. Those who fled like Frank were simply disqualified. Those who descended into utter madness failed the most crucial test of all. The job didn't require a hero or a genius. It required an anchor, someone who could stare into the abyss, feel its pull, and not leap. Someone who could endure the ultimate isolation without breaking for 7 straight years. And then, the final, most personal and most unforgivable truth flooded my mind. Michael, the phone call. It wasn't an accident. The voice had been a lie, a beautiful, perfect, soul-shattering lie. My brother's death had been exactly what it had always seemed, a tragic, senseless, and mundane accident. The entity had no interest in the truth of his passing. It had simply plucked the single greatest source of my pain, the foundational trauma of my life, and twisted it into the final key for the final lock. It was the ultimate test. It needed to know if I could be manipulated by my own grief, if my personal sorrow could be used to compel me to step across a forbidden threshold. The invitation wasn't just the open door. It was the lie that made me willing to walk through it. By choosing to believe in a dark conspiracy over a meaningless tragedy, by choosing the hope of an impossible rescue, I had passed their final exam. I had proven myself worthy. The torrent of information ceased as abruptly as it began. I was on my knees, not in the void, but on the worn, checkered linoleum of the diner floor. The kitchen door was closed, the bolt firmly in place. The neon sign hummed its familiar tune. The refrigerator growled to life. Everything was exactly as it had been, but I was irrevocably and fundamentally changed. The grief for Michael was still there, but it was now accompanied by the hollow, echoing agony of knowing I had desecrated his memory by believing the lie. All the rage, all the fear, all the desperate need for answers had been scoured out of me, leaving behind a vast, calm, and hopeless emptiness. The old Leo, the boy who was saving up to escape his hometown, had died in that void. A new being was wearing his skin, a being who understood the terrifying mechanics of the universe and his own insignificant yet permanent place within it. A year has passed, or maybe it has been a decade. Time has a different texture now. I can feel the thinness of the world, the subtle vibrations from the other side of the wall. I still make the coffee. I still wipe the counters, but I no longer feel the loneliness. The silent congregation is always here now, a comforting, familiar pressure in the air. The man in the suit and the woman in the coat still come in, but they are no longer tests for me. They simply nod, a gesture of collegial respect, before dissolving back into the night. I am no longer their subject. I am their peer. Sal, I learned from the infusion of knowledge, had completed his own 50-year tenure. The invitation had been his retirement. My acceptance was his release. I am the manager now. That is the cosmic joke that passes for a reward. My prize for enduring 7 years of psychological hell is an eternity of presiding over it. My escape from this town was a foolish, childish dream. This diner is not a place you can leave. It is a fundamental constant, and I am now one of its variables. I am the gatekeeper. I am the warden. And my one and only duty is to ensure the cycle continues, to find my own replacement. Tonight, a pickup truck much like Sal's rattled to a stop outside. A young man walked in, his face etched with a nervous optimism I vaguely recognized as my own. He was looking for a job, something to keep him busy, a way to save up some money to leave this dead-end town. He said his name was Ben. He had kind eyes, filled with a future he still believed he could control. I hired him on the spot. As he prepared to leave after his first day shift, I stopped him at the door. I reached into the drawer beneath the register and pulled out the familiar, greasy, yellowed piece of paper. It felt different in my hand now, not like a threat, but like a sacrament. I slid it across the counter, making sure my fingers did not touch his. "Ben," I said, and the voice that came from my mouth was not my own. It was a flat, tired, emotionless rasp that I had heard 1,000 times before. It was Sal's voice. The rules for after midnight. I watched the flicker of confused amusement in his eyes, the same disbelief I had once felt, and I knew his trial had already begun. He took the paper, folded it, and put it in his pocket. As he walked out into the fading light, I gave him one last piece of advice, the only true and merciful thing I had left to offer. "Just do what it says on the paper," I called after him, my voice barely a whisper against the rising wind. "And a word of advice, don't try to understand." He gave a final, uncertain wave, and then he was gone, leaving me alone in my kingdom of light and shadow, to wait for the night and to watch over the next candidate in the long, unbroken, and inescapable line.